Jenny Ziviani.
Okay, so when I was given the topic of participation interventions, I tinkered with it, and as I've been listening to the conversation today, and after my afternoon tea conversation with Mats, I have called it focus, means and outcome. Now, I'm not suggesting that they're all mutually exclusive. I'm just suggesting that we need to consider participation intervention in each of those domains. We're talking about participation. We've used the word involvement because it's attendance and involvement, and I think we should agree on that as a definition. And it's in life situations, so they're complex routines in social contexts, and they're directed towards meaningful goals. And we've looked at those two concepts of attendance and involvement. But when I looked at the word interventions, if we look at how it's described, it's the act of intervening, interfering, or interceding with the intent of modifying the outcome. In medicine, an intervention is usually undertaken to help treat or cure a condition. Now, as I think about participation, I don't really think that that's the word intervention is the right word for us to consider in that context. So when it comes to participation, I agree that we do talk about our interventions, and I think that's just language again, like engagement, involvement. But I think that the way we look at participation, because it's such a collaborative exercise, it's more about that facilitation and enablement approach to working with people. So I've had a look at what's out there, and I think if we look at the studies that have been done, if we look at how they've been written up, we see participation identified in a number of ways. There's a lot of research out there, and Leanne and I have been involved in this sort of work ourselves, where it's identified as an end. So you identify it as what you're trying to achieve. So your outcome is participation, whatever that might be, what it might look like, or how you're going to measure it. But it's an assumed outcome. So you identify it as a goal, but you're doing something else, and you assume that the outcome of what you've done will change that social situation that we call participation. There are other studies, and Christine's here, where it's a focus, it's a means, and it's an end. So that we're looking at participation as ticking all of those three boxes. So it's what you're working towards, it's the means by which you're going to achieve it, and it's also what you're wanting to determine as your outcome. And there are other therapies out there again from the work of Robert Palisano, where again we see that same trajectory. So I always remember way back when we were working with children with DCD, and there was that whole debate about, we're going to use the movement ABC to measure performance, and then we're going to train them up on those skills, and we're going to use it again to measure our outcomes. And the criticism that came through in the literature, because you were training them up on the outcome measure. But I would argue it's different with participation, because I think that with participation, it's that scaffolding and structure that you're doing in situ that you're really wanting to have as your gold therapy outcome. It's the real target that we're trying to achieve. So if I have a look at some of the key issues that come through in the literature when we're talking about participation in interventions, things come through consistently. It's things like collaborative relationships, so it's that partnership concept. It's the concept of mutually agreed goals, again establishing that level of understanding. And I go back to the point that I raised before about goal setting. When does that occur? Does that occur before intervention, or is it part of that intervention process? And I would actually argue it's a reasonably active ingredient in the intervention process because it's that shared understanding and that raised awareness of what it is that you're trying to achieve. And it involves child and environment strengths and needs. In other words, you're looking at the child in that context and the strengths they've got and the facilitators within that environment. And again, it's about joint evaluation, both the process of how you're going to get there and the outcome. So there have been a number of systematic reviews. I've just put down a bit of an example here. Most of the reviews that have been done have looked at children between about 6 and 16. They've looked at conditions, with ASD, DCD, CP, Down syndrome, intellectual disabilities, if you look at the cohorts that have been included. The nature of the interventions that they've described have usually spoken about individualised coaching as an approach. There's a lot of emphasis on the leisure context, and I can understand that because of the importance that leisure is for youth with disability. They prioritise that above many other things because of the enjoyment element. There's also things about skill training, and they tend to be goal-directed. The outcomes as identified sometimes don't relate directly to participation, but they'll talk about outcomes such as friendships as an outcome. They'll talk about social skills, school attendance and involvement, and use things like the CAPE and the school function assessment to measure these. Most of them, in most of the studies, they've had participation as an assumed outcome. So it's that concept of an assumption made that whatever they're doing, the participation will improve. And they've looked at participation as both a subjective and an objective measure. Okay, so if we're going to be facilitating or enabling participation, let's unpack the ingredients. What do we know in the literature that informs those key ingredients? And I'm glad we've spoken about bike riding before because I was trying to find something that might be relevant. So if we have a look at the active ingredients, and I guess I've grouped them into 3 bundles. And it's just one way of looking at them. I'm sure there are a multiplicity of ways of looking at these. But from the literature that I've read and from the work that we've been involved with, I guess importantly I see that individualised goal setting and engagement, because I see the goal setting as part of that engagement process. How you engage someone in an intervention is part of setting those goals. The intervention itself, which I will describe as multifaceted. In other words, I don't think there is one single intervention. I think from what we see though, it's usually, if we're talking about participation, it's best that it's done in the community or in a home environment in context. And thirdly, the therapist family-centred approach. So in terms of goal setting, I guess the piece of the puzzle that I think is so important is that we're all travelling in the same direction. And when I say all, I mean that's that shared understanding that I was talking about before, is that the child, the parent and the therapist, the coach, whoever we're talking, the teacher, we all understand, we've got an understanding where it is that we're all wanting to head together so that we're not trying to go in different directions. So that process of collaborative goal setting, I think, is key. And we know now, I think there've been the book by Sandgaard and Levac in 2014, and the book with Paulson and that I was involved with recently on goal setting. There's enough literature out there to show us the power of goal setting. So I think that's almost a given now. The important thing about goal setting, though, is that it's collaborative, and that was that message that I tried to get across before, is that we're all travelling in the same direction. So everyone in the team brings expertise. The child brings expertise. You know, they know their understanding of themselves and their desires. The family brings along expertise. They understand their social situation. The health practitioner brings knowledge and expertise that they share as well. And I think with our community partners in either sporting organisations or in the schools, together, if we bring together all those elements, then we've got a way of really being able to support a goal that is both important to the child. For example, here I've just got to be able to attend school camp. Now, to be able to attend school camp, Mum might be able to help by being able to support the child in a number of skills as well. For example, being able to do up your shoelaces so that you can do it independently while you're at school camp. But the reason you're doing it at home or getting ready for school is because it's all building up towards this common goal of attending the school camp. Again, I said before, and I'll apologise, my lens is the lens of someone who has probably looked at this work over many years, and because I need a theory base, I've taken self-determination theories away from me to help understand the key elements to engagement in therapy. Self-determination theory really helps us understand goal motivations, and I've put this here just because what it does is for those not familiar with self-determination theory, it's one of those encompassing motivational theories. There are thousands of theories of motivation out there. This one basically talks about psychological needs. So that as individuals, we've got psychological needs for well-being, things that motivate us, and they relate to a sense of autonomy, and that is a sense of choice. They relate to relatedness, which is just the fact that people care about us, support us, nurture us, so that we feel cared for. And competence, not that we've got the skills, but that we've got the sense that we are able to do things, that we'll give it a go. So it's not a categorical competence, I can do it, mastery concept. It's that, I suppose some people call it self-efficacy, a belief in ability to do something. Now, if we look along, self-determination theory has really a continuum of internalised to externalised regulations. So the more intrinsically motivated you are to do something, the more likely you are to engage in it. But most activities that kids do particularly are not intrinsically driven. Leisure and play and joyful participation are the intrinsic motivations. But more often than not, there's some sort of external regulator for what kids are doing. So it's either the fact that I'll do it because it's important. No, it's important to me because it will enable me to go to school camp. In other words, it's important that I learn how to do my shoes and get dressed in the mornings on time because that will help me go to school camp. So there's a reason why I'm doing it, and I've identified it, so there's quite a bit of internal regulation there. But it's not the same as I've got no intention to do it, I'm no good at it, I'm not going to try. You know, that sort of a motivation level. So often I find if you listen to kids, if you listen to them talking, and if you ask them about their goals and you listen to the words that they use, they actually give you the key to understanding what fuels their motivation. And often, in self-determination theory, then we've got that concept of autonomy, which again is that behaviour is volitional. It usually reflects an individual's values. It's a feeling of choicefulness. In other words, you know, in therapy sessions, again, you might identify, you know, Mum wants you to learn how to do this, you want to do that. The teacher says it'd be nice if you can do this. Okay, we've got 3 things that different people want. Now, out of all those, which would you like to start with? So there's a choice. You know, you're not saying, no, we're going to learn to do this, we're going to learn to do that, but there's a choice. So you've got some ownership of what's going to happen. You might not want to do any of them, but you might at least say, that's the least unpleasant one that I want to do, you know? So again, that choice is important. The relatedness one, again, is that it's the fact that I matter, that what I think is important. So you're listening to me, you're listening to what I'm saying, and you care about me enough to listen to me. And I think that's a really important message to give people if, in that process of engagement, that you feel valued. And the competence piece, again, is it's that sense of willingness to try. So it's that persistence with the task, often because you feel you can do it. So that's that concept of ongoing mastery. But you might not be particularly skilled at it, but you're just prepared to keep on trying. So if I look at that, again, I'm an OT. I think I'm born and bred an OT. I think it's in my DNA. I can't help but think as an OT. So I guess when we looked at this, we looked at it in the concept of PEO, the Person, Occupation, Environment model of Mary Law's work. But what we did is we were thinking more about just not how we do it. In other words, you know, we look at the person, we look at their environment, we look at their occupational goals. But I guess what we were really interested in was, in the centre of that, I don't think that's going to work, we've put the autonomy, relatedness and competence at the heart of how we do it. Okay, if we have a look at some of the literature around of qualitative work, so what people with disabilities and parents are telling us about their participation goals, what's really important and meaningful for them. There have been a number of reviews now that have actually drawn together some of that qualitative data. If you look at the words and the themes that emerge from that literature, what you come up with are things like trust, genuine concern, acceptance, authentic friendships. These are all the things that they talk about being meaningful in terms of participation. They look at the fact that there are agreement on goals and there's some choice, which we've spoken about before. The other things that are valued are feelings of being given confidence. You know, the fact that you can actually do it, and we've heard some beautiful examples today of how people have responded to those opportunities and how much confidence they've gained from being able to try things out. But the fact that they're challenged that bit, so they're achievable goals, but they're not too easy. They're stretching them just that little bit further. The fact that you can actually experience a bit of success is important to people, so that they can demonstrate what they can do. And I think Peter was saying before, when we were just listening to one of the presentations, there's nothing nicer for a child to be able to go home and show a parent or a grandparent a new skill that they've developed, or something that they're actually quite proud of, that they can share with family and friends. And a feeling of inclusion, you know, having fun and enjoyment, that's come up again and again. But if we have a look at those, and we look at the words, again, we look at the words, I come back to that underpinning theory that I feel captures it, is that we come up with autonomy, a sense of relatedness, and a sense of competence. So the words map against some of those key principles in self-determination theory. If I look at the intervention now, this intervention, or you know, what we're going to facilitate or enable to happen, if you look at what's been written out there, it's really multifaceted. It's complicated. You know, if it's going to work, it's really quite a complex undertaking. And it involves the environment. You know, we've all heard importantly today about how important that environment is, social, physical, etc. But when we think about environment, there's a number of ways of looking at it. There's the concept of infrastructure, and you can be blocked from doing things because you haven't got the funds, the uniforms, the equipment to do it, the availability of resources to enable you to participate. It can be the nature of the activity, or it can be cultural ideas or prejudices that, you know, people believe you can't do it, so there's no opportunity to try. Or it can be procedural, so it's the lack of social support to do it, or the way the activity or the opportunity is managed or structured. So there are ways of looking at environment that can be both facilitators and barriers, and challenges to participation. Some years ago, when I was doing some stuff with Mary Law again, we were looking at that concept of environment and how if you tweak the environment a little bit, you can move people along. At the time, we thought about it as a continuum, but I won't even begin to go there again. But I guess what you can do is, for example, you could actually provide some infrastructure that would enable you to actually attend and participate. You may be fully involved, but you can shift just being able to get there by some environmental modifications. So again, it's just highlighting that without exploring in detail people's situations, and that's why I say it's so individualised, I don't think one size fits all. So the thing about participation too is that often there's this issue of awareness. People often don't know what they want to participate because they've got no idea of what's out there. You know, if we think about what's in the community, you know, what people would like to do, unless we know what those options look like, you know, they've only got some ideas in their head, something they've seen on TV, something that their friends are doing, but they might not think about something like a bushwalking club. Didn't know they existed, quite like walking, social, and it's an activity that you can do lifelong. Or, you know, there might be a swim group that's a little bit more inclusive in terms of some of the children with disabilities. But having information, I think, is one of the things that is the hardest thing to get, and having local information is really hard to find, and it changes all the time. I don't know the answer. The other thing is that it needs some sort of scaffolding opportunities so that it's not either being an inclusive organisation or a segregated one. You need every option available to you. Often it's trying to find things that are non-competitive, and I don't know how you've all found this, but it's really hard to find things that are non-competitive. And kids know when they're being treated differently in that environment, and they know when they're being sidelined or not chosen. So finding organisations that actually foster involvement, attendance, being part of a team without necessarily being competitive, I think is a challenge for us as a community. I've mentioned segregation versus specialisation, but obviously enjoyment is the critical thing for sustained participation, being able to enjoy it. I've raised this thing here on the side. The Australian government has put out a tender to the Australian Institute for Sport to actually look at physical literacy. So when they're talking about physical literacy, I guess it's that awareness of what is involved in, we need to understand it. We need to understand it's got a social component, it's got an affective component, a cognitive, and a physical component. So it's got a range of elements. Now, I put that up because I became aware of this tender because I was involved in, we do a national report card on children's physical activity where we look at what's the state of the nation? And often it's not looking pretty good. It's looking pretty bad, actually. And so through the contacts I had there, I was invited to participate with this group here. There was no awareness of children with disabilities. In a lot of the conversation, we were assuming quite high-level skills. And it really I really felt incumbent to be the voice for kids who maybe are not going to be able to participate at that level. And I think that the way it's developing, I'm hoping, will provide a structure that will inform teachers and coaches and the community at large that it's a very complex issue that can be scaffolded, and that it applies to all children. I'll wait and see. If we look at the child focus, again, we're child-centred in our approaches, we're family-centred. The words that keep coming up when I look at the literature are around, there's a huge emphasis now on coaching. You know, the word coaching gets used a lot when we're talking about participation. I think you can't really coach until you've attended to that issue of awareness, so knowing what you want to coach for. But coaching does sound sort of unidirectional in some ways, doesn't it? So I think that it's a term that I think is used wisely. You know, it's not teaching, instructing. It's more facilitatory. But I think in some ways it doesn't give the sense of learning from the participants themselves in the approach to the intervention. And I think it's probably a little bit of a balance of both that we need. There's a lot now on solution-focused barrier resolution. So that discussion that says, you know, what are the reasons why you can't do these things that you want to be able to do, why you can't attend the soccer team, why have you stopped going, what's changed? So trying to understand what some of those limitations might be and identifying those barriers. And there's a very important role for skill development in context. So we need to also know, it's like all of us, you know, you learn a new skill and you realise you've got a sub-skill there that you're not doing so well, so you might go home and practice and practice and practice. I don't know how many other parents have had a child obsessed with cricket. How many balls have we thrown? How many balls repeatedly thrown, ball after ball? Just so that you can, you know, get that movement skill happening. So you're doing it for a reason. So it's not that that skill isn't you don't want to practice the sub-skill, but it's just that it's contextualised. It's for a purpose. So if we look at the belief in self-competence, and this is the piece that I think is really important and why we need to scaffold, there's nothing worse in terms of undermining self-competence than failure, giving someone something that's just way too hard. If it's too hard and they're not going to be able to achieve it, they're not going to want to keep trying. So being able to be sure that it's pitched at a level that is achievable but not too easy, because they'll know if you're making it too easy. And in the process, if they're not able to undertake that activity or task that's part of their goal, maybe involve them in part of the solution. And I think, you know, there are a number of approaches around there which really look at problem solving from the performer's perspective. So we do it again through that graded skill acquisition. We support the concept of mastery. We scaffold performance and all the things that we do as therapists and practitioners. We use a coaching approach and we look for optimal fit in the tasks that we offer. So at the child level, for those of you who are familiar with Helen Politako's work, Helen's really spoken about how children can problem solve and take control of their learning in a situation. So I think if we take a child focus in this, we revisited the co-op model, looking at it from the point of view of self-determination theory. So we did a retrofit. So co-op wasn't developed with this framework in mind. But as we spoke about it and played with the idea, we could see the three elements of autonomy, relatedness and competence actually embedded in the way that co-op was being used. So the important thing there was that it was situating that goal setting, that autonomy, that choice as part of that intervention at the very start. We did the same with another intervention approach, which was occupational performance coaching, and this was parent-focused. So this was looking at a way of an intervention that might actually work with parents to enable them to look at how they problem solve different participation goals. And again, it was around participation. So initially, with occupational performance coaching that Fiona Graham from New Zealand was working on, she spoke about these three things: autonomy, support, involvement, and structure. So they were the three terms that she used in her original approach. Again, as we looked at them with our retrofitting eye, we could see that from a theoretical point of view, we again had elements of autonomy, relatedness, and competence in there. So I guess what I'm saying is that there are lots of good theoretical models out there that allow us to understand those key elements, those key ingredients that we use in therapy. So I don't want to reinvent a theory, I don't want to reinvent the wheel, but this one to me just is a nice fit to help us understand what we're doing. I'm sorry Dana wasn't here today. I would have loved the opportunity to spend more time with her talking about the work that she's doing in her work in those environmental interventions. Again, I think we heard from her work how the importance of the identifying those goals, having ownership of them, and also looking at those environmental intervention or the facilitators and barriers at the intervention as an intervention approach. If we look more broadly, these coaching approaches are just coming through now in a lot of our literature. So they'll talk about client-centred coaching. It comes up in reviews. We've got solution-focused coaching. So the language out there has moved away from teaching, instruction, intervention to coaching, which is a much more facilitatory approach to looking at some of these the ways that we're working with children and families. And even if it's not stated, when you read the documents, it's embedded in the documents. So the more you look around, the more you see that this is an approach that seems to be becoming more widely used. Now, the piece that I would like to focus on, that I think we haven't focused on a lot in the past, is throughout all of this work there's one common theme, and that is the interventionist, if you want to call it the interventionist, or the therapist, or the facilitator, whoever it is. That person exists throughout this whole process. And in many ways, I think we need to put the therapist back into therapy, because I think, I don't know if it's your shared experience, but I know from my working life, I know I went through being, the soft OT, being nice to people and working nicely with them, to becoming the scientist who delivers the protocol in a set way. And I think what's happened in trying to be evidence-based in practitioners is that we can't lose that piece that's who delivers the therapy, because it's how we do it, the engagement piece, that I think we need to remember in our interventions. And thank you to Gillian King, because she also has done another one of these conceptual models. We seem to be very good at them, in which she spoke about the therapist and therapeutic change. And this, I think, came out last year. And when I read this, I thought, again, it captured that essence of what I think, we're at risk of losing. And she broke it up into this quadrant, and the quadrant basically was looking at the therapist variables, something about the therapist per se that can influence an intervention. It's something about how that therapist relates with the with the client, that relationship piece, the two of them together. Thirdly, it's how that therapist, client and the intervention interface, how that works for them as a team. And finally, it's the implementation of that intervention. So in this approach, we know that the therapist uniformity is a myth. Okay, there is no uniform therapist. We don't all do it the same way. We all have our own way of doing things. And even with training and manualisation of interventions, some therapists will always achieve a slightly better outcome than others. And we've seen that over the years. And interestingly, if you look at the contribution, only about 5 to 8% of total variability in outcome is attributable to therapist differences. So if you think about intervention outcomes, that's not so bad. So if we look at the alliance, it's about that therapeutic alliance, so that's being in tune, that attunement process. It's the same as, when you're thinking about a parent and child, that attachment process. It's being responsive to the other person's need. And there's been some recent work interested in how that alliance actually works, but it relies on that partnership, and my colleague Peter here speaks about that partnership between client families and the team of clinicians, which is really consistent with those principles of family-centred care. So the current models of therapy intervention delve into and clearly articulate aspects of family-provider partnership to inform practice. So we're beginning to articulate this partnership more clearly in recent times, so that it's not just a black box that we don't talk about. We actually articulate what that looks like in family-centred care. And obviously, looking at aspects of treatment implementation, the two things that come through there, I guess, and we're beginning to grapple with them a lot more in the intervention work that I've been reading about, is the concept of fidelity, that the intervention is being delivered as it was planned to be delivered, and the concept of dose, which I'm still not really happy with. Dose is just the amount or the strength received, and I think in many ways the concept of dose is not something that's delivered, but something that someone is prepared to partake in. So there's that choice piece there of dose. So you can give them the medicine, but they may not take it, and I think it's the taking that we're interested in. Okay, so if we bring all those sectors together, that's where I see therapy engagement. So it's bringing together those key elements. I'm waiting for the questions after this one, and it's not going to be pretty. I see bringing the therapist, the family, and the intervention together as that process of therapy engagement that we've been talking about. And I think that's part of what drives our client outcomes. Okay, so Christine mentioned the work of Felicity Bright before. Felicity Bright's a speech pathologist from Auckland who, again, did some work around this concept of engagement in adult rehab. And in her systematic review, she really pulled together what the literature was saying about therapy engagement with this in the adult population. And she spoke about it as this concept of engaging with and in engaging in. So the process of connecting with the activity or a person was that process of engaging with, so connecting. And this was influenced by the clinician's attitudes and their behaviour, so that was critical. So again, the clinician is an important person here. And establishing that relationship almost occurred before the state of engagement, which she calls engaged in. So she saw this again as a fluid process that could change. Someone could say something that really upset you and you could disconnect from that process. So So it's fluid and it's not well captured in measurements. We don't have measures of it. The concept of engaged in is actually involved in what constitutes therapy, and she describes that as an internal state. It's the way you feel about it right now when you're involved in it. And there can be some observable behaviours that describe it. It might be contributing, talking, persisting with something. It can be both an internal state, and there are some behaviours that you can observe. And again, most of the measures out there are around the observed behaviours. We don't have a lot of the reported internal state measures. So, to put my puzzle together, I think that for engagement, for enhancing participation, that the key lies in the hands of an evidence-informed practitioner. So I think that we can engage people as frauds. And I think that if you have a look at a lot of the interventions that are out there, and you look at them and you scratch your head and say, what's the evidence for that? There's a lot out there. And people participate, they pay for it, they attend, they do what they're supposed to do because they're engaged. They believe what they've been told about the nature of the intervention. They have got trust and confidence in the therapist, and they can do what they've been asked to do. So I think it needs to be in the hands of an evidence-informed practitioner, and I see that the engagement part will manifest, as I said before, in an affective component. In other words, I have got that, I'm enthusiastic about what's being done. I believe in this. I'm really keen to get started. There's a behavioural, I can do this, it fits within my routine, it's achievable for me. And a cognitive, I really believe this is going to make a difference. So they're the three pieces of engagement that I see, and that aligns with the work that Gillian King's been doing and that we've been doing in this measure on the prime. But I see the key as our three wings down there of self-determination theory. I see that as the how we tweak it. So we can tweak engagement by allowing the child more choice, by scaffolding the activity, by assuring them and demonstrating how valued they are in the situation. And I think that we can, my little animations didn't work, never mind. Anyhow, it tweaks. So you can tweak that key. And I think it's the three elements in there that you can, and as therapists, as practitioners, how you can change an activity, how you can make someone feel that they've got more competence at doing something, or you can affirm their behaviour. You can give them the sort of feedback that they need that will keep them involved. So I think that the engaging with is what we do as practitioners, or the therapist piece of this. And I think that the engaging in is that self-determined behaviour, which is what we're seeing in terms of that engagement process. And I'm going to throw one more picture in here, and that is that, thinking about this as a lighthouse, and again, Christine will know I play with pictures and models, and we all do in our own silly way. But again, I see the foundation elements as the PEO that I showed you before, the person, the environment, and the occupation. I see this sort of spiral staircase of how we look at environmental barriers, facilitators, individual strengths, limitations, etc. And how we do it, the service section, is our self-determination theory. That's how we tweak it all. And what we see as a result of that is engagement. That's what shines through there, is engagement. And I think people will tell us that's what they think about their involvement in an activity, so we'll hear what they say. We'll see behaviours. They'll demonstrate some behaviours. we need to ask them what they're thinking as well. So it's not just what they're saying in the situation, but what they're actually thinking. So I think that self-report piece that I mentioned earlier today is really important. And because I'm going to close with this one, the challenges, I guess, that I see. Now, I've spoken today about this individualised, tailored, community-based, one-on-one supported intervention that is going to enable these children and families to participate in their community so that they'll have well-being and they'll have good quality of life, all the things that we assume is going to result from that, and be personally meaningful for them. But how expensive is all this going to be? You know, I keep thinking, you know, if the bean counters looked at cost effectiveness, how are we going to justify this? So I think the first piece of this is that, is there a way that when we're delivering these interventions or these facilitations or enablements, that there's a way of thinking about it in terms of generalisability? In other words, are we providing families and individuals with enough confidence that they can then go and attempt or engage in another situation with all the skill sets that they've really got from this one experience? Can they just maybe have a telephone call to their practitioner that they trust that says, you know, I've come up against this barrier. Can we problem solve how I might go about doing that? And I think, and are communities better informed and able to facilitate participation by others? You know, I think at the population level, if we chip away at one organisation, are we going to make it more receptive to having other people come in with varying needs? So I think, I see this as a huge task. You know, I think, you know, we need organisations to be more receptive at the population level. We need people to be more proactive in how they engage with community organisations. I don't think it's easy and I haven't got the answers, but I do think these are questions that we need to start thinking about in the way we undertake our research. So I'm not quite sure if that's what you wanted me to talk about today, Christine.
What will we say?
But I like to leave that with you, and I guess we'll, I think I'm on time. I think if we can maybe take up some of that discussion later, I'd be very pleased to. Thank you.